Hello, welcome to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. We are going to be looking at Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10 today. And I will start in about 45 seconds. And I'm going to take a sip of my coffee. Midday coffee. It's good. We'll start in about 30 seconds. Okay, welcome again to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. We're looking today at Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10. And again, as always, these YouTube live stream Bible studies are recorded and archived on our church's YouTube page, so you can go back and watch at a more convenient time. So I want to begin with the first of three P's. The three P's are prayer, perspective, and pieces of scripture. The first is prayer. And so I'm going to share a prayer with you that I shared with you last week. And this comes again from Reverend Dr. Marcia Williams. She's the Associate Conference Minister of the New York Conference of the UCC. And this is a prayer that she wrote in the midst of the pandemic. Lord, please help me to see you in the face of every human I encounter, to be more faithful in my commitment to my faith community, to be more generous with all that you have blessed me with, to be more patient and loving, to be more kind, to not remain silent in the face of evil or injustice, to just be more like you. Lord, help me to be better tomorrow than I was today. Amen. Okay, the second P is perspective. And those of you who have been watching these YouTube Bible studies over the past weeks and months, you know that one thing I try to emphasize is the importance of perspective when studying and interpreting the Bible. And the technical word for this is perspectivalism. And it actually emerged in the late 1980s. Two scholars defined this whole idea of perspectivalism. And it's basically the recognition that each one of us approaches the Bible from a different perspective, or from a perspective that is unique to us. And also that perspective has been shaped by who we are. We call it our social location. So our race or gender identity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, level of education, nation of origin, how we were raised, what was the religious makeup of our family of origin. Each one of these and many others contribute to the construction of our identity and the construction of our social location. And that then impacts the perspective we have when we interpret the Bible. Now, one of the advantages of perspectivalism is that it encourages us to try on new lenses outside of our comfort zones in order to get a different perspective. What it does is it can break apart perspectives that we've taken for granted. And this is especially helpful for those of you who are raised in, say, conservative Christianity, where there are certain words and phrases and assumptions that are used and made that have a controlling effect on our ability to critically evaluate our faith. And by opening ourselves up to other perspectives, we can actually break apart that fallow ground and be more fruitful in our understanding of Christianity and our living of this faith tradition. So when we have different perspectives, or when we're exposed to different perspectives, it can actually make us more compassionate and empathetic of others, and also more humble. Because if there's always another perspective, then we become less arrogant that, my way is the right way. And we become more open to the possibility that truth is found outside of our narrow perspective. Now, perspectivalism helps to answer interesting questions like, for example, why do Marxists in South America, Marxist Christians in South America, why do they see the beast in the New Testament book of Revelation as the United States, while conservative US Christians have generally understood the beast to be the Soviet Union or the United Nations or something else? Well, the way you explain that is different perspectives, different social locations are impacting how people are interpreting something like the beast in the book of Revelation. So perspective influences interpretation. Now, I want to be careful here because not all perspectives are equal. Not all perspectives should be treated as morally equal. So, for example, if you're going to use the Bible to justify slavery or to oppress women or to hate gay people, if you're using the Bible to damage people, then that is not a valid perspective. So, it might be interesting to understand why someone would hold a perspective like that, but that's not to say that that perspective is of equal value as a different one, because the telos of interpretation, the end goal, the end point is to become more loving. That's what we're trying to use the Bible to help us do. It's to become more like, in the Christian tradition, to become more like Christ, become more loving and compassionate. So, one of my favorite phrases was used by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his letter from Birmingham jail. Now, he's using it in a different context than biblical interpretation. What he talks about is uplifting human personality, uplifting human beings. And so I pull that into my own understanding of how biblical interpretation works. And I say that interpretations that uplift human beings are the ones that we should privilege, while interpretations that degrade or denigrate or damage human beings should be rejected. So not all perspectives are to be treated equally. Now, every week, as you know, I try to offer perspectives to help us see things differently in the scriptures. And I like to do this because I like to give us new sets of lenses through which we can read. So you've heard me talk about social scientific interpretations or historical critical interpretations or narrative criticism, a narratival approach to the Bible. I've talked about reader response, so meaning being constructed in the encounter that the reader has with the text and not embedded inherently in the text itself. I've talked about the importance of context, social context, cultural context, and also literary context within the Bible itself. I've done a little bit of comparison with you, so drawing in on stories or other things that seem similar to a story that we're looking at in the Bible in order to draw out new and fresh meanings. And all of this comes under a much larger category in the study of religion called the anthropological approach to religion. Why is it that human beings do this thing we call religion? And what are some traits of humans practicing religion, regardless of cultural context? So I'm going to keep returning to these various perspectives in the weeks and months ahead because they're tools for us. They're tools in the interpreter's toolbox. Now, today's perspective, and we're still on the second P here, today's perspective will help us to think about why it is that Paul in Romans chapter 13, and we're going to look at Romans chapter 13 in just a second, why it is that Paul in Romans chapter 13 refers to love as fulfilling law. Paul doesn't say in Romans chapter 13 that love fulfills the law. He doesn't use the definite article the. Our English translators, if you're looking at the NRSV Bible, they have failed us in Romans 13. Paul does not use the definite article the in front of the word law in Romans 13, verses 8 through 10. So if he were to have done this and talked about the law, which he does in other places in his letters, typically what he's referring to when he uses the definite article before the word law, he's typically referring to the Mosaic law, the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue, in addition to other precepts in the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. So he's talking about Mosaic law when he uses the phrase the law. But in Romans 13, verses 8 through 10, Paul says love fulfills law, no definite article. So the implication is that it's all law, not just Mosaic law, but every human law. So then, when understood this way, love becomes the telos. Love becomes the goal or endpoint of all human laws. So if that's what Paul's saying, and I think it is, that is a very bold statement. So today's perspective, more specifically, is drawn from Richard Rohr's book, The Universal Christ. And if you do not own this book, I would strongly encourage you to pick it up. It's not that expensive, and it is a fantastic book. It's one of the best that I've read in several years. The Universal Christ. Well, in this book, what Richard Rohr does is he gives us a little summary of the work of a French Jesuit priest named Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. So what Teilhard de Chardin says, according to Richard Rohr, is this. Teilhard de Chardin was trained as a paleontologist and geologist. What he said is, according to Rohr, love is the very physical structure of the universe. That is a very daring statement, especially for a scientist to make. Now, Teilhard de Chardin was famous for constructing a theology based on the structures of Darwinian evolution. So bringing these two things together under one heading. So he basically constructed a theological system that used scientific discovery as its backbone. So that's what Richard Rohr is referring to here. So he says that is a very daring statement, especially for a scientist to make. But for Teilhard, gravity, atomic bonding, orbits, cycles, photosynthesis, ecosystems, force fields, electromagnetic fields, sexuality, human friendship, animal instinct, and evolution all reveal an energy that is attracting all things and beings to one another in a movement toward ever greater complexity and diversity, and yet, ironically, also toward unification at ever deeper levels. This energy is quite simply love under many different forms. So that is a pretty bold statement because, if Teilhard de Chardin is right, then the reason Paul says love fulfills law, again, it's not the law, but all law, love fulfills law, is because love is both the foundational fabric of the cosmos and the telos, the endpoint or goal of human activity. We're all being drawn more closely together over ions of time into this singularity. Okay, so that brings us to the third P, pieces of scripture. This is Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10. And here's what Paul says. Owe no one anything except to love one another. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word, love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. And again, you see how the English translators have inserted the definite article twice in this section, both times referring to the law, even though in Paul's Greek, he does not use the definite article. So that last phrase should say, love is the fulfilling of law. Much broader than just the law, as in the Mosaic law. Now, before we dig into these three verses, I just want to talk about the context. And I did a little bit of this last week, but I want to reiterate some of those points because it helps to set up what Paul's doing in verses 8 through 10. So the immediate context is the context that precedes these three verses, and it's Romans 13, verses 1 through 7. And in those 7 verses, Paul talks about the authority of the state. The state does not wield the sword in vain, he says. Now, those 7 verses have been misused quite frequently in Christian history to justify oppressive systems of government. St. Paul says, the government doesn't wield the sword in vain, so you better fall in line. Governments have been ordained by God. Now, when you start teasing that out, what you realize is this is a way to justify oppression. So during the American Revolution, loyalists to the British monarchy would quote Romans 13, 1 through 7 to say to those folks who were engaged in the American Revolution that they were on the wrong path, because St. Paul says all governments are ordained by God. That includes the British monarchy. So you, by engaging in revolution, you are coming up against the precepts of God or the will of God. And these verses, chapter 13, verses 1 through 7, were used in the 19th century to justify slavery. Slavery was legal and ordained by the government, therefore ordained by God. And so these verses were appealed to justify slavery. So this is the dark side of how those verses can function in various cultural contexts. They can be used to justify oppressive government. But what Paul is doing in chapter 13, verses 1 through 7, when he talks about government, is he's setting up his discussion about law in today's verses 8 through 10, the very next section after he talks about government. So the idea is that even the telos of government, the endpoint or goal of government, is this principle of love. So just prior to Romans 13 is the section that we looked at in Romans 12 from last week. And in that section, Paul, as we saw last week, what he does is he talks about what genuine love looks like. So he's talking about love in multiple places in these two chapters. But in Romans 12, he gets very specific when he talks about what genuine love is. It's abhorring what is evil, clinging to what is good, honoring one another, basically putting someone else's needs above your own, praising them before you praise yourself, being ardent in spirit, being hopeful and patient and prayerful, helping and supporting other people in the church, extending hospitality to strangers, loving enemies, living in harmony. The list goes on and on. There are more than 25 do's and don'ts in those 13 verses of Romans 12 that we looked at last week. But basically, today's text in Romans 13 is an extension of this description of genuine love from Romans chapter 12. If genuine love is all of those things, and if people lived in the way Paul describes, then there would be no need for law. Everyone would be living by the principle of love. So that's the immediate context, the context that precedes our verses. In the next chapter in Romans chapter 14, Paul gets very concrete. And he talks about what it looks like to live in love within the Christian community, within the church. And he talks about some areas of friction that were in existence in the Roman congregations in the first century. And he deals with those issues from the framework of love. How do we work through these difficulties as people who are committed to loving each other? So that's Romans chapter 14. So this whole idea of love extends from Romans 12 through Romans 14, and Paul touches on it in multiple ways. Now, the broader context of the letter to the Romans, and we saw this last week, the letter to the Romans is organized according to the principles of persuasion in classical rhetoric. So you have an exordium, an introduction, right in chapter 1. You have a narratio, which is a narration of the background issue under discussion in the letter. And the background issue is that Paul wants to visit these Roman Christians and then head off further west to Spain. So you have a narratio, a narrative background. You have a propositio, which is a thesis. You have a series of proofs in the letter after the thesis that defend it. And then you have a peroratio at the end, which is a summary, which includes an emotional appeal. And that's very common in classical rhetoric during a speech. You want to end on an emotional appeal. And that's what Paul does in Romans chapter 15, where he returns to this idea of him wanting to visit the Roman Christians and then move further west into Spain, because Paul sees himself as a missionary to the Gentiles. The thesis of the whole letter to the Romans is in chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. It's just 2 verses. And that's where Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it's the power of God for salvation. So what he's saying is that the gospel is this announcement of God's plan to transform the world and set things right, to bring justice and peace and healing and transformation in our lives and also in the world. So the letter to the Romans lays out a series of proofs after that thesis that defend the thesis. Paul talks about faith. He talks about the cross of Christ. He talks about the Spirit of God in Romans chapter 8. He talks about the relationship between Jews and Gentiles and tries to heal the friction around their relationships with each other. And then he talks about love, which is our section, Romans chapters 12 through 14. So the implicit question that he's raising, when you have this larger view in mind of what's going on in the letter, the implicit question is, how can we participate in God's cosmic plan of bringing justice and peace and healing? Well, the answer is by observing the principle of love. Okay, so I'm going to reread verses 8 through 10, and then we'll go phrase by phrase through this. So again, Paul writes, "Owe no one anything except to love one another. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law." So the first phrase in verse 8, owe no one anything except to love one another. Now, some scholars have tried to read this phrase, owe no one anything, in economic terms, as in, don't have any debts, don't have student loans, don't have a mortgage, etc., etc. No, that's not what Paul's getting at here, because Paul is talking about social relationships. There is an economic piece to social relationships, absolutely. But the primary thing that he's focused on here is the interaction of people, social relationships. And again, in Romans chapter 14, he delves more deeply into social relationships within the context of Roman churches. But in talking about social relationships, what Paul is addressing is this fundamental ethical principle in the ancient Roman world, which was honor and shame. So one pursues honor in their life. They could be born into a family that had a certain status and would therefore be born into a status of honor. Or they could try to attain honor during the course of their lives. They could join themselves with a group that had honor. They could win a foot race in the Olympics and gain honor. There are many ways one can gain honor, but that's the goal. You want to gain honor, and you don't want to be shamed, especially publicly shamed. So in our modern Western context, we don't necessarily have this governing principle of honor shame in the same way that they did in the ancient world, because it was closely connected with patron-client relationships. So the patron, just by virtue of being a patron, had honor, and the client, by linking themselves to a given patron, would gain honor for themselves. So the whole superstructure of Roman society is built on patronage, patrons and clients, and supporting that was this understanding of honor and shame. So that's what Paul is assuming when he talks about owing no one anything. What he's saying is, as a follower of Christ, you're not bound to honor all people in the way that they are honored in the honor shame system. And in that system, if you're of a lesser status, you're bound to honor somebody who is of a higher social status. But Paul is trying to move around that whole system and say Christians are bound to honor everybody equally because they're guided by this principle of love. So regardless of rank, we, as followers of Christ, are bound to honor all people equally. So there's no honor shame system. There's no system of patrons and clients. There's no hierarchy, there's not intended to be a hierarchy. as followers of Christ, you treat everybody according to this principle of love, and there is no hierarchy. So when he says, "Owe no one anything except to love one another," we don't owe special honor to certain people and not others. We owe love to everyone. So it's a different social code that he's getting at here. Now, just a side note. Some people have argued that when Paul talks about loving another or loving your neighbor as yourself, he's only talking about love within the church, which is to say that the principle to love a neighbor as oneself doesn't apply outside the confines of the church. Now, this is a popular viewpoint, especially in conservative Christian circles nowadays, because there is a sort of tense understanding among some conservative Christians that there's a discrepancy between, especially if they're Trump supporters, what they see in the Trump administration and how they understand the principles of love that they find in the New Testament. So the way you get around that tension, you want to continue to support a political group that isn't abiding by these principles, and yet you believe these principles to be true. The way you get around that tension is to say, well, these principles only apply in the confines of the church. Loving your neighbor as yourself doesn't exist in the context of government or outside the walls of the church. It's a very narrow understanding of this idea of loving one's neighbor. Now, on the face of it, that argument is pretty absurd. And the reason why is because, in one sense, everything that Paul says in his letters is designed for Christians, because that's who he's writing to, right? So when Paul talks about the cross and resurrection of Christ and its significance, of course, he's talking about it immediately in the context of Christian churches. But we wouldn't then say the cross and resurrection of Christ only apply within the confines of the church and not outside the confines of the church. No, that's not how it works. We understand that the immediate application is for people who claim to follow Christ. But we also understand that the spillover effects are relevant outside the walls of the church. So the cross isn't just useful inside the wall of the church, just like the principle of love is not just useful inside the walls of the church. These, at least in the Christian tradition, we understand them as having universal applicability beyond the confines of the church community. So that includes the cross. That also includes this principle of love. The immediate application is love the neighbors in your church, yes. But that doesn't mean you don't love neighbors outside the walls of the church. So I wanted to just make that clear as a side note thing. So the principle of loving another is actually more demanding than existing social codes. So legality is one thing. You can do a lot of things that are legal, but not ethical, right? And the same holds true when it comes to love. Love demands more than just what is legal. And Paul says that love fulfills law. And in verse 10, he writes, love is the fulfilling of law. And again, there's no definite article before the word law. It's not the law. It's love fulfills law. The word love is the Greek word agape. And it's one of the creations of early Christians when they're talking about agape, that they're talking about it in both a theological and an ethical context. This is sort of new in the ancient world for people to be talking about love in the way that the early Christians were talking about it. So the early Christians would talk about it theologically. God is agape. 1 John chapter 4, verse 8. Paul in 1 Corinthians 13 talks about faith, hope, and agape remaining, but the greatest of these, he says, is agape. And then we actually find the verbal form of this word agape in Matthew 22 when Jesus talks about the greatest commandments. The greatest commandment is love God, and the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. That's what he says. And the word love there is the verbal form of the word agape. So love fulfills law. Agape fulfills law. That's what Paul says. What does he mean by fulfill? And here, one commentator, his name is Robert Jewett, he says fulfill means to accomplish law's original intent and purpose. To accomplish law's original intent and purpose. So it is fulfilling in that sense. It fulfills the law. It fulfills the original intent and the purpose of law. And that, because Paul doesn't use the definite article here, love fulfills law, it applies across the board. Whether it's Jewish law or Islamic law or American law or Japanese law, whatever kind of law it is, love is the telos. It's the ultimate goal of law. That's what Paul's argument is. Now, verse 9 in today's reading is interesting because Paul quotes specific commandments. So he says the commandments: you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: love your neighbor as yourself. Now, you probably can recognize that these are coming from the 10 commandments. There are 4 commandments of the 10 that Paul cites. The one about adultery, murder, theft, and coveting. The question is, why doesn't he cite all 10 commandments? And that is a great question, and scholars don't have a clear answer, but they have made a lot of suggestions what they think might be going on here. But I personally think that the reason Paul only cites 4 of the 10 commandments of Mosaic law, the Decalogue as they're called, why he only cites 4 of them is because if you notice, the 4 that he cites have a universal quality to them: adultery, murder, theft, and coveting. Coveting being the desire for something that isn't yours, that you then act upon, right? And it leads to theft or to murder or to adultery. So these 4 in particular have a kind of universal quality to them in the way that one of the 10 commandments, keeping the Sabbath, doesn't. And that strictly applies within the context of Judaism. But these other ones seem to be more universal. You can find them in other places and in other cultures. So this connects with this phrase, love fulfills law. So Paul is deliberately citing the 4 commandments from the Decalogue that have a universal quality to them, because the point he's making is that love fulfills law as a universality, not the law, specifically the 10 commandments. So that's what I think is going on here, is he's deliberately citing those precepts from the Decalogue that have wider applicability than just Judaism or early Christianity. So what he's done is he's opened up the notion of law to something bigger than just Mosaic law. All law is summed up and fulfilled in the commandment to love one's neighbor as oneself. So that's why love fulfills law. Love fulfills law because it's this universal precept or principle that governs all social behavior, and it makes a demand of people that goes beyond the precepts of a written code. It always asks more of us, and it always challenges us to live more fully into it. So I want to close with a little story here told by Peter Rollins in his book, The Orthodox Heretic. And that's this book here. And this little story is called The Third Mile, and it's basically a parable. So Rollins in this book is basically what he does is he creates a whole series of parables that have some relationship with the New Testament Gospels, but each one of them makes you think. And this is an example of one as it relates to love that makes you think. So here's what Rollins writes. One day, a small group of disciples who had embraced the way of Jesus early in his ministry heard him preaching by the side of a dusty road. And they crowded around, and they heard Jesus say, "The law requires that you carry a pack for 1 mile, but I say carry it freely for 2." The disciples were deeply impressed by these words, for at that time a Roman soldier had the legal right to demand that a citizen carry his pack for a mile as a service to the empire. This teaching not only allowed the disciples to turn this oppressive law into an opportunity to demonstrate kingdom values, but also presented them with an opportunity to suffer in some small way for their faith. As it was common for soldiers to evoke this law, the small band of believers soon developed a reputation for their actions. Roman soldiers would often hope that the citizens they asked to carry their packs would be among these disciples, and often a small bond of friendship would develop between a soldier and one of these followers of Jesus. After a year had passed, this custom had become so established in the group that it became a defining characteristic of their shared life. The leaders would frequently refer to the teaching of Jesus and emphasize the need to carry a pack of the Roman soldier for 2 miles as a sign of one's faith and commitment to God. It so happened that Jesus heard about this community's work and on his way to Jerusalem took time to visit them. The leaders eagerly gathered all the members of the people to hear what Jesus would say. Once everyone had gathered, Jesus addressed them. "Dear brothers and sisters, you are faithful and honest, but I have come to you with a second message, for you have failed to understand the first. Your law says that you must carry a pack for 2 miles. My law says carry it for 3." So here's how one way that Rollins explains this story. What he says is love pushes us beyond duty rather than stopping there, and acts when we don't know for sure what the ethical thing to do is. If the ethical question is what must be done, love adds, "I will do more." So cycling back, this is the reason why I think Paul speaks in such universal terms when he talks about love fulfilling law, and why he only cites those 4 precepts of the Decalogue, the ones that have a universal applicability beyond something like Sabbath law. It's because he sees this principle of love as fulfilling law in all of its forms, because love asks and requires of us more than just what's written in a legal code. Okay, see you next week.